Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the IWDA session on imagining and building feminist futures after COVID-19. We're really happy to see you all here. We're thrilled that you're here, and hopefully others will keep joining. We had hoped that this would actually be an interactive Zoom session, but we found that it is in fact a webinar. So we will adjust, and we hope that we will have an interesting discussion. So first of all, let me just say, I imagine that we have all of you joining us from different parts of the world. Welcome to all of you. As I said, we were trying to make this a very interactive session. We'll try to make it as interactive as we can, given the constraints of technology that we find ourselves within. Just to say that when we are imagining feminist futures after COVID-19, it's a huge field, and there are going to be many different views on this, and we would like to hear all your views. Don't be intimidated if you feel that your view might be a minority view. Please share them. We'd like to hear your views. I just want to say also, in terms of interaction, people can post in chat. I see Steph Perrin has just posted something. Steph is from Southern Alberta. Thank you, Steph, and others can do the same. So we will, through the chat function, we will encourage your questions, your comments. Thank you so much. What we had intended right away was to actually hear from you. So we wanted to hear your thoughts on what do you imagine as a feminist future, building from this immense crisis, which has been COVID-19, which is also coming at the same time when we have other kinds of crises. We are facing a very severe climate crisis. We are seeing governments all over the world which are increasingly authoritarian. We're seeing a backlash against women's rights. And obviously this is going to vary a lot country by country. So we would really like to hear from you. Just if you could in the chat say, what's your name, where you're coming from, and a word or two about your own thoughts about a feminist future. And as you write them in, I will read them out and share them. Well, actually everybody can see them, but I will just sort of pick out a few. Okay, we have Brody here from Wellington, New Zealand. Welcome, Brody. We have Maureen from GWI, New York rep for GWI. What is GWI? Anyone? Feel free to say, give us a glimpse into your notion of what a feminist future is. Okay, so we have Joanne from Sandler from New York City. A feminist future is where care and justice matter and people and the planet thrive. Thank you, Joanne. Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Maureen. GWI is Graduate Women International. Thank you. Anybody else like to share their vision? Fantastic. Thank you, Steph. Steph says that when I think of a feminist future, I think about centering on community, justice, and joy. Thank you very much. These are issues that are going to be picked up again in the panel that's going to follow. Hi, Binny from London. Okay, would love to see more women in leadership positions or having the ability to pursue their dream careers, business ventures without being held back. Okay, very good. Thank you, Binita. Thank you. Fabiola from Public Services International Mexico. Welcome. Brody says, a feminist future to me is intersectional, where equity is the standard of living and treatment for all. Love these ideas, just beautiful ideas. Thank you. Maureen says, I think of equal power sharing, education and career opportunities, regardless of race, class, or gender. Fantastic.
And Prabha, there's...
Prabha? Okay, hi Prabha. Prabha Khosla says, focused on feminism, justice, care, and the well-being of the planet. Economy focused, not growth focused. Yes, that's a really excellent point. Thank you so much. And so much of what the new economic model is focusing on. Power sharing. Vicky says, my feminist future will center the most marginalized. Thank you, Vicky. Fantastic. Thank you so much. So you have all shared, you're sharing. So Laura is saying feminist future will mean less conflict and more unity. Thank you, Laura, from Bristol, UK. Hi, Faharnaz. Fahara? No, it's Faranaz. It's Faranaz, maybe. Greetings from Calgary. Great. Nice to have you here. So we've got a lot of lovely ideas. We've got beautiful values that you're sharing. Multiple perspectives are valued, bringing people to the margins, focus on care, focus on equity, more women in leadership. These are all wonderful feminist values and principles. Thank you so much for your visions. I'm going to turn now to the panel. So the way this session is going to go is that we have 30 minutes for a panel discussion. And then we are going to work on a very exciting interactive tool that the International Women's Development Agency, IWDA, based in Australia, has developed, which is a feminist futures toolkit. And we're going to actually play with it, get to know a little bit about how it works, and see if you like to use that in your own organizations. And it's freely downloadable from the IWDA website. So that's all to come for now. We have a really, really interesting panel for you. We have Alice Ridge, of course, from the who's a research policy and advocacy advisor from IWDA. And Alice is going to talk about that Feminist Futures Project. We have Maria Jose Moreno, who's the Global Gender Justice Advisor for Oxfam International, based in Nairobi. So it's very late for her. Thank you so much for staying up. Who's going to talk about Oxfam International's own work on feminist futures, which really centers care and well-being, an issue that you have raised in your comments. We have Nalini Singh, who's the ED of the Fiji Women's Rights Movement. And Nalini's going to talk about what does building feminist futures look like from the ground up. And she's going to talk about Fiji. And then we're going to go global and go to Joanne Sandler, who is the former Deputy Director of UN Women and currently Senior Associate at Gender at Work, who has written a very interesting article recently with Anne-Marie Goetz on can the US deliver a feminist future? So we're going to go from the local, very local, to the global. So first, if I can ask you, Alice, can you tell us a little bit about the Feminist Futures Project?
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you all so much for joining. It's really exciting to see so many people here. My name's Alice. I'm joining this webinar from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, Australia, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining the call from and pay my respects to elders past and present. So this project, Imagining Feminist Futures After COVID-19, really started to come about 12 months ago I'm sure a lot of other people have experienced this too. I've just started getting notifications about photos I took a year ago of the first Zoom call with my friends when we went into lockdown, or, you know, all these memories from right at the start of COVID. So it's a really interesting time to be reflecting back on those sort of early weeks and months of the crisis. So in Australia at that time, COVID had been on the radar for a while, but what we were starting to see around the end of March and the beginning of April was a real escalation in both in terms of the cases of COVID infections that we were seeing, but also in terms of the response measures that the government was putting in place. So we really felt like the boundaries of what was possible started to change really rapidly. So for example, before COVID, unemployment payments in Australia had been stagnant for over 25 years, and there'd been a huge community campaign to try and raise the rate of these payments, which hadn't really been making headway with the government. But when COVID hit, the government doubled the unemployment payments overnight, which was, you know, far beyond even what the campaign had been calling for in terms of an increase, and really was completely shocking and unprecedented that there would be such a huge increase to these payments all of a sudden. And so, you know, I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture. There were certainly aspects of the Australian response that weren't ideal, and I think, you know, that the issues we've seen in many parts of the world with COVID being used as an excuse to roll back rights, I think, you know, has certainly played out here as well. But what we did see in those really early weeks was just a complete redrawing of the rules of the game and what was possible. So we wanted to explore this idea, this sense that the normal rules were out the window, the normal ideas about what was possible in terms of, you know, feminist social change had just really changed dramatically, and we wanted to try and capitalize on that moment. So what we decided to do was create a workshop methodology which would draw on futures thinking approaches to try and explore the trends that we're seeing in the world, the way that those trends are interacting with COVID, and then how they might play out differently in the future because of this moment that we're in. And critically, we wanted to ask the question, what does that mean for our work? What should we be doing differently now in order to get to those feminist futures? So we worked with a team of futurists who designed an adaptable workshop methodology, which the idea is that it can be run by anyone. So regardless of your experience with futures thinking, it's designed to be run by someone who's new to all the concepts involved. And it's also designed to be run online because, of course, we're all working virtually. So we worked with this group of futurists, and we also put together a steering group of feminists from around the world, and most of them are on the panel today. We're just missing one person who worked with us to help kind of refine the concept and test the methodology. And we're pleased to say it's now freely available to download on our website. So Aruna, I've got just one or two examples of things that we're seeing coming out of those workshops. Would you like me to share those now?
Yes, please.
Great. So, we've been running these workshops since last year and making all the findings available on our website. And the idea behind that is really that for diverse groups around the world to be using this methodology to generate their visions of feminist futures, which we can kind of pull together and start to build up this really diverse picture of what the future could look like. So to give you a couple of examples of the kinds of things we're seeing coming through, one of the trends that we explore in the workshop is funding sources for women's rights work drying up, particularly as countries are focusing all of their resources on response to the pandemic. And so obviously this is like, it's very easy to see the negative possible outcomes of this trend. You know, there's not enough resources for the work that we do, and those critical services go unfunded, or that advocacy work isn't able to happen. It's, it's really easy to see the negative outcomes of that trend. But what this what the methodology enables us to do is to say, what are some unexpected positive outcomes that could come from this situation, and how can we help bring those about? So 2 different groups looking at this same trend came up with really different ideas about what a feminist future could look like in this scenario. So the first was a group of sexual reproductive health and rights activists in Australia who saw the potential for the pandemic to shift SRHR from being viewed as a niche issue to a critical and essential service, which could really change how it's funded into the future. So it demonstrated that rather than simply focusing on funding at the moment, the critical thing was to change the way that SRHR is viewed in this pandemic moment as a critical health service in order to change the way it's funded into the future. And then in a totally different direction, a group of feminists in a session that we ran for the Global South Women's Forum looked at this trend and saw a future where funding no longer flows to INGOs and to Global North organisations, and instead it goes directly to Global South women's rights groups. And the critical thing in that scenario was that this work around shifting the power within the feminist funding ecosystem was really critical. And rather than seeing the demise of a system that doesn't necessarily work for everyone, it could be seen as a positive, that it's a way to kind of establish a new system. So that's some of the things, I guess, that we're seeing coming through these workshops.
Thank you so much, Alice. It's a really interesting tool. We've all actually gone through a process of, helping to put it together and also to experiment with using it. And it has a lot of flexibility. And so I would encourage all of you to go to the website, the IWDA website, take a look at it and you can download it. And there's also tutorials on how to actually use it. So it's a very user-friendly tool. So thanks so much, Alice. So from that, talking about the need for thinking about a feminist future and a tool to help us collectively, to help different groups collectively to brainstorm about that. I want to turn now to Maria Jose. Oxfam International has, of course, been addressing now this issue, has worked on feminist issues for a long time. You have a long history of this. Most recently, you have produced a paper where you center, it's called Feminist Futures, Caring for People, Caring for Justice and Rights, where well-being is really centered as the principle for thinking about the future and for the attainments of social justice and rights. So if you could tell us a little bit about that, Maria Jose, over to you.
Thanks, Aruna. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. I'm really excited about how this issue is bringing us together. Yes, when the pandemic hit us at the gender justice community of Oxfam, we started thinking if this is a critical juncture, a liminal moment, what we will propose systemically in order to change? And I am very happy to say that a lot of the things that have been proposed in the chat have come as well in this paper. And we have worked with the community of the gender justice community through Oxfam. And there have been a group of core 4 authors, Claire Coffey, Kim Piaget, Sebastián Molano, and myself. And we have broad experience. What we thought is that when we spoke about care in general, there was a tendency to see it linked to families, linked to kinship, and that there was, from a feminist perspective, the need to reimagine care in our economies, in our social justice, and in our relationship to the planet. And that in a way, the neoliberal system has as well fended off our imaginations to think about care only in very restricted circles. And then we thought that care in social justice, in economic justice, and climate justice will address the facts that with an intersectional feminist perspective, the issues that now care is so feminized, so racialized, so devaluated, and in some ways, it is as well following identity lines between us and them, no? The people, for example, from our country deserve care, but people from other groups don't deserve, no? And in that sense, we thought that reimagining care will be to reimagining cultures, to build new instruments for economics, to reimagining as well what is social justice, and to address inequality from this intersectional perspective, no? Because of course the virus has reinforced inequalities, but have reinforced inequalities along lines that were already there, no? And then the caring economies and caring societies and caring for the planet cannot be done if we don't include in care the right to food, to housing, to universal basic services, social protection, health, universal basic income. And this global pandemic and economic, political, and social crisis created a moment to reimagine all these things, no? We think in the paper there is the proposal to, of course, to address the issues with hands-on care, the issue that of the redistribution between men and women, between the state and families and private, the development of infrastructure to facilitate care, no? The lockdowns showed that care continued to be very feminized, and that in the health sector as well, care was very feminized. We thought that in the economic model, that conduces as well to the climate emergency in which we live, the extractivist systems, the carelessness with the next generations, etc. And we thought that it was an opportunity for the feminist movement to work with progressive allies in all sectors and to work in systems in an intersectional ways, rethinking our understanding of valuing work and workers, care work, but broader, proposing universal basic services and universal basic income, accelerating the transition to low carbon sectors, and reimagining our economic thinking and our governance in order to bring centrality to civil society organizations, women rights organizations, and the leadership of women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Jose. as you were talking, and you fleshed it out really well, and of course the paper does that really well as well, is I was reminded that there was a UN Women had a meeting, I think last year, fairly about the middle of last year. And it was, when the pandemic had really hit us, and it was all economists and others who were feminist economists. And one thing that they said that really stood out for me was that care is not only a women's issue, but care is an existential issue for mankind. And I think
Humankind.
what you've been talking about really, frames that very well. We have a question about where can we get access to that paper. It's in
It's
Farana's.
online.
It's
in the chat.
It's in the chat function. If you look at that, there's the link is there. Okay, so thanks so much, Maria Jose. So I'm going to turn now to Nalini. Nalini, can you talk to us about your work with the Fiji women's rights movement and the work that you're supporting and partners on building a feminist future from the ground up?
Good morning, Bula Vinaka from Fiji. I hope you can hear me. Talking about feminist futures, definitely technology, is part of it, and I'm having a bit of a challenge this morning. So I hope I remain connected, throughout the session. But wonderful to be part of this panel. To share from Fiji and the Pacific about the work we have been doing for over a year now in relation to coping, responding, recovering, and working together with everybody else to build the future that we actually want in Fiji and the Pacific. So for those of us, who are not familiar with the Pacific, it's referred to as the Blue Pacific. It's a vast region, and our geographical realities are vastly differing from each country that speckles the vast Blue Pacific, and so has been the impact of COVID-19 in our subregion, with some countries having really had the significant brutal impacts from COVID, with fast spreading virus like in the French Polynesia, as well as in Papua New Guinea at the moment. And then there are some countries which have not had any cases, very small countries. And then we have countries like mine, Fiji, where we have not necessarily had community transmission because it's been contained at the borders. However, for the Pacific, and I'm sure you can all conjure up the image of the beautiful beaches and the hospitality, what it has meant is that a significant proportion of our population as well as economy has been decimated. And this is because of the reliance that some of our states have on the tourism industry, with the sort of halt in terms of travel for leisure and pleasure and even work. This has meant that we've had many people who are out of jobs. What it means in the Pacific, it's not, so we are calculating in Fiji, we knew much earlier on that we, out of a population of about 900,000, about 150,000 would be immediately affected with jobs. But it's not just the one person, it's up to 4 or 5 or 6, because that person supports those many people in the family. And what we very early knew in terms of the impact on women, all women for us to think about, is that the majority of women working in the immediate sectors that include as well as small and medium micro enterprises. These are all majority led by women. So it's significant impacts, if I can say. So our way of responding immediately was recognizing that in terms of the work that we were doing as part of the Fiji women's rights movement here in Fiji in the Pacific, was that we needed to immediately work with like-minded women experts, tap into our Ministry of Women, Department of Women, to ensure that our analysis, from the work that we do on the ground to those that sit in the offices and crunch numbers and look at policy, etc., knew what they were going to be facing, not just in the short term, but medium and long term. So this was the kind of work we started immediately, and it's just a few days past the 1-year anniversary of the virus reaching our shores here in Fiji. And we were spot on partnership that sparked on from this horrible virus that decided to disrupt all our lives. And that analysis paper that we did in the very beginning was at first not taken seriously by those in decision making, but we held it high and held it up, because every other paper that was written by the UN agencies, etc., it all meant that they were reflecting on what we had said much earlier on, and this was as early as April last year. Moving on from there, of course, working with different partners, we formed a civil society alliance for humanitarian relief, because we needed to respond to those women and families that were that didn't have any food to eat, because they had lost their jobs, they couldn't go back into the communities, there were lockdowns being announced and restriction of movement. So immediately, up to 8 organizations, very diverse organizations, but with a firm peg on human rights and serving our communities, came together and formed the Civil Society Alliance for Humanitarian Relief. And we are still working a year on, listening to our women, paying attention to what the needs are, and doing our best to provide those, if not ensuring that there is some sort of a state response to that. Aside from that, there's breaking certain rules, like we still are having a curfew night, so there's a coalition that's been working, the NGO Coalition for Human Rights has been monitoring it. What this means, and I'll be wrapping up in just 2 minutes, that the perspectives in the Pacific and the way we are responding, because of our realities, the fact that we are so isolated and remote, we are such small populations, we are dependent on our trading partners across from the world for our rely on. this has been the wake-up call. So looking at our unique realities, looking at our culture, the way we connect our the functions the community plays in terms of ensuring that we continue to survive, has meant that women from the grassroots up to in the echelons of power now have to at least listen to each other, and organizations like mine are helping with that process together with others to bridge that gap and to make sure that the meager funding that we get, as Alice talked about, is going into the right places. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nalini. It's, you've really highlighted the role of women's organizations, community-based organizations, human rights organizations in addressing this response to this horrible virus, and how, coming together to form that alliance for humanitarian relief, and also coming together to lobby the state to make sure the state, in fact, meets its responsibilities. And so the critical importance of women coming together in response to this crisis of joblessness and lack of food, all of that caused by COVID. I want to pivot now completely, going from the very grassroots, where civil society has been, critically, have been a critical player, to the United Nations. Joanne, you together with Anne-Marie Gertz wrote a paper that was published last year in Gender and Development, and the title was, "Can UN Deliver a Feminist Future?" And we all know, all of us who've been, kicking around for many years now, that the UN has, in fact, provided a very important global foundation for the issue of women's rights. The Beijing Platform of Action, which is now 25 years old, was a really important and progressive agreement that 189 countries signed up to. But now the moment has changed. We've heard that, Alice talked about that, Maria Jose talked about that, and so did Nalini. COVID and, all these other crises. Multilateralism has taken a real hit. So it's really important now for us as women's rights activists to say, is the UN still fit for purpose? Could you tell us a little bit about your article and where you come out on that one?
Thank you, Aruna, and thank you for that great setup. I want to thank IWDA. I want to thank you for moderating, and Nalini and Maria Jose and all of the participants. And of course, thank Anne-Marie for co-writing this with me. As you say, of course, it's not the UN itself, right, that delivers anything. It's the UN as a platform that hosts member states, UN organizations, civil society, private sector, citizens interacting with the UN. So the question is, how does the UN, or how did the platform of the UN galvanize the kind of interest that enables a feminist future? And as Anne-Marie and I debated and thought about it, I think our answer was yes, if. So the if is very important. What's the if, right? And as you said, Aruna, we're optimistic because we believe that in multilateralism. We believe that multilateralism has something to offer the world. And if we ever doubted it, the COVID mantra of none of us are safe until all of us are safe is, I think, a really good example of why we need multilateralism, or what the potential is for multilateralism as a backbone if there's political will. At the same time, we saw with COVID that the multilateral response was very weak, and that member states had a hard time coming together, and the UN had a hard time galvanizing member states. So back to what if. In our article, we go through a number of ifs that are preconditions, we think, to the UN providing a platform to envision and imagine a feminist future. And with only 5 minutes, I'm just going to highlight 3. And the first is if we can imagine a UN that walks its talk. So if the Secretary General and the UN's leadership take the power that they have to create an environment inside the United Nations that reflects the very norms and standards that are agreed to in intergovernmental processes, that would be an internal system, much as Maria Jose was talking about brainstorming for your organization, right? Can the UN itself, in its internal processes, imagine a system that is based on human rights, dignity, respect, and a culture of equality? A workplace where staff thrive and where well-being is centered. The UN, as someone who worked there for a long time, is far from that at this moment. In fact, as we know, it's patriarchal, it's hierarchical, it's competitive, it still works primarily as a pay-to-play system. It's not different from many other organizations, but it is the place where these norms and standards are generated. So can it actually step up to the plate and integrate those norms and standards into its own practices? Staff are demoralized, often cynical. Leadership often points to member states as the blockage, but you can't really blame member states for the culture of impunity that exists for sexual harassment within the UN. You can't really blame member states for the lack of accountability of senior managers. You can't really blame member states for spending hundreds of millions of dollars hiring high-priced global consulting firms to fix things that don't get fixed. These are things that are within the power of the UN's leadership to fix. And so we need a UN that actually is the preeminent organization in the world in performing and institutionalizing gender justice, as well as equality in relation to race, religion, ethnicity, gender identity, ability, age, and many other factors. We need a UN that can model for the world what that looks like. So that's the first thing, and it's challenging, but it's actually easier than the other two. Because the second is we need to reimagine a UN that is really the people's house. That means that venues like the Commission on the Status of Women, where we are participating right now, need to have all sectors represented on the planning committees and the oversight mechanisms that develop these venues and other high-level forums. And that the representatives, when civil society, women's rights organizations, and feminists sit on committees, it's not tokenistic, it's equity. There are equity at the table. So it means that women's rights and feminist organizations from the grassroots to national, regional, and global organizations should be on the bureau of the Commission on the Status of Women and the executive board of UN Women. Feminists called for this 10 years ago when UN Women was established, and it would be a small but significant outcome of the Generation Equality Forum. Number two is also challenging, though the precedents exist for it to happen. The third one is the hardest. The third is that feminist organizers and organizations from around the world will continue to see the UN as a viable, generative, and useful space for organizing, because questions have been raised about that. And once feminists and other social justice constituencies give up on the UN, it will become increasingly irrelevant. If the UN is not able to do number one and number two, the likelihood of number three becomes greater and greater. And so I hope we can urge the UN to step up, and very interested to hear what others have to say. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Joanne. So we've heard a lot of very interesting ideas here in the last 30 minutes. I really do want to open it up to anybody who would like to make a comment or to ask a question. There is a function on here which will allow me to just, allow you to talk. So if anybody would like to do that, just send me a chat message and I can open up the floor to you. Of course, you can comment in the chat function itself. But I do want to make some time available for your comments and questions. So please feel free. We've heard a lot of really interesting ideas. So we have Shell Goldstein. Shell, would you like to speak? Okay. So, Shell, you have the floor.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
I've come in very late and caught some of it, and very impressive, and was particularly impressed with what Joanne was saying. And I think your summation was kind of like to encourage the UN to take this on internally. I'm wondering whether, beyond encouraging, whether there's any leverage to pressure that to happen, as in all the UN women's organizations threaten to leave and such.
That is definitely an interesting strategy. Thank you for that that idea. Definitely worth thinking about. Anybody else? Would anybody else like to make a comment, ask a question? Come on, there's so many of you on this. We really want to hear from you. Okay, I've got somebody now.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, Steph. Is that Steph?
Hi, I just wanted to comment and say I really appreciate the idea of reimagining the UN. This was a conversation I was having with a friend the other night about the importance of doing that work to reimagine, and how easy it is to criticize these systems and argue for them to be dismantled rather than doing the work to reimagine them. And part of that is around sustainability and how important it is to avoid a consumption mentality where systems or movements are thrown out if they aren't operating perfectly, and just recognizing the power and knowledge and resources that exist within those systems and how to reimagine them. So more of a comment, less of a question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steph. Yeah, anybody else? We have just a few moments for comments. Let's see. Is that Shell again? No. Is that Shell? I mean, it's an interesting idea to think about reimagining the United Nations. It's also interesting to think in contrast how the economists have really been, have turned economic ideas on their head. And those are the ones that we are really drawn to now. Okay, we have a question here. Prabha, can I put you on? So Prabha says corporations and the Global Compact have already occupied many spaces in the UN. How can we challenge them and fight for women's rights at the same time? And Bronwyn, our friend Bronwyn, says, what were some of the other surprising results of the Feminist Futures methodology? Okay, so 2 questions, and maybe the first one, Joanne, would you like to comment on that one? The first one about the corporations and Global Compact? And then I'm going to turn to you, Alice. So Joanne, go ahead.
Right. Well, I think thank you for the question, Prabha. I think one of the effective things, and we talk about this in the article, is I don't know how many of you have seen the work that the International Center for Research on Women does in, for instance, giving a grade to the UN Secretary General, who the feminist UN Secretary General every year. Which is powerful. It actually, keeping feminist eyes on powerful institutions and speaking out loudly about the extent to which there is coherence between their words and their actions is a powerful mechanism. And so I think that your point about, how do we look at things like the Global Compact and not just the words underneath it, but how they get implemented and do things like grading, annual grading, annual speak outs, etc., are very, very important. They take a lot of time, they take a lot of energy. And I think that's the basic question that we were exploring is it worth it? Is the return for feminist organizing, gender equity and gender justice enough to put in the kind of work that's required. But I do think that there are opportunities and we haven't used them. We haven't used our collective voice in powerful ways as much as we could to call for the kinds of responses that we would like to see.
Thanks, Joanne. That's really important. Is it enough, and how do we make it more effective? So next, Alice, you get to close this out. We have this question about surprises from the feminist methodology, futures methodology.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And if I can, if anyone else on the panel wants to reflect on anything that struck you from participating in one of the workshops, then feel free to jump in after me, because it'd be great to hear your reflections as well. But something really surprising that came out of one of the workshop discussions for me was a conversation about the trend of violence against women, and violence against women in the context of COVID-19, in lockdowns, this real sort of increase in prevalence and severity of violence. And the reason that this was a surprising discussion to me is that I think as women's rights advocates, we're very good at talking about the problems that we're facing and what needs to be done immediately. You know, what are the really short-term immediate solutions? People are in danger, people need safety and support. What are the immediate things that we need in place? But what this conversation enabled us to do was to come at the problem from a really different angle and think about, well, in 10 years' time, we can imagine a world where binary, heteronormative, nuclear family-based relationships are no longer the norm, because after COVID, so many relationships have broken down, whether through violence or through just the pressures of lockdown and people falling out of love and going their separate ways and agreeing to co-parent or agreeing to, you know, live a different kind of life to bring up children communally. We sort of realized that there was this world we could imagine where family structures and community care looked really different. And it was really surprising to see that future come out of this trend of increasing violence against women, which is absolutely awful and which absolutely needs an immediate response. But because we're always so focused on that immediate response, we don't always think about the longer term potential implications or the surprising ways that the world could look really different in the future. So that was something surprising that came out of it for me. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in and share, or we can move to the next segment. But if anyone else had a reflection, feel free to jump in.
Anybody have a comment? Otherwise,
yes, Aruna, if I may.
Please, go ahead.
I remember the workshop we did with the steering committee was some of us. Exactly what Alice said, you know, as women's rights activists, feminists, we are responding continuously to the emerging challenges as well as the existing challenges. So for me, when we were doing the workshop, and someone in our group put up, you know, the complete it sort of stopped us it stopped me in my tracks, because I was like, yes, of course, you know, we're constantly fighting, you know, the notions, the impact, the implications, and imagining a world where we had actually dismantled it completely, you know, was kind of interesting. Made for really good discussions, linking it to what Alice just talked about in terms of family, and the notion of how that is evolving so fast.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nalini. I'm so glad you made that intervention. So I want to thank the panelists for their really, really interesting observations, their comments, and that kind of wraps up the first part of our session today. And I'm now going to turn it over to Alice, who's going to walk us through one particular piece of that methodology, the Feminist Futures methodology, so that we can all get a sense of really how does this work. So thank you, panelists. Thank you so much to all of you who have commented, who are have put in comments and questions in the chat function. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And now I'm going to turn it over to Alice.
Thanks. So what I'm going to do is talk through one of the tools that's part of this workshop methodology, Imagining Feminist Futures After COVID-19. And originally, as we said, we wanted this to be really interactive. So we were going to send you off into breakout rooms. But at the end, instead, I think we'll just open up the floor again if people would like to offer reflections on the impact wheel that I've presented. Just a chance, I guess, to hear from you again. So I'm flagging that up front so you can think about maybe what you might like to say. So this tool, hopefully my slide's going to work again. There we go. Okay, so this tool is called an impact wheel, or sometimes called a futures wheel. And it's a tool that provides a space for exploring multiple possibilities and mapping change over time. So it takes a known trend, which you can see at the center of the wheel, and plays out the different impacts of that trend over a number of years. Some of the impacts are positive, some of them are negative, and there can be multiple impacts at each level, which don't have to exist in the same possible future. So it's really a tool for looking at multiple possible futures. So usually in the workshop methodology, you're working with a predefined set of trends, but for today, in sort of preparing for this session, we wanted to have something that we all had in common and that we were motivated to discuss. And so this idea of the future of CSW was what we decided to focus on. So you can see the description of the trend on the side of the screen here, which I'll read out. So the trend is that CSW maintains a hybrid online format into the future. COVID-19 has forced the whole world to go online, and CSW is no exception. In coming years, a hybrid model emerges with limited in-person participation in New York, but greatly expanded online participation available to civil society around the world. So usually in the workshop, you would do this impact wheel collectively. So you'd start with the trend in the middle and then work together to populate this sort of mind map. But what I'm going to do is talk you through what we've done and then hear your reflections on, do you agree? What did we miss? What else could happen? Etc. So the trend here in the middle of the circle, so these darker circles are sort of the like 1 to 3 year impacts of the trend. And then as we move out progressively, we're going further into the future and we're thinking like a roughly 10-year time horizon. So, okay, this first thread is about the loss of direct access to member states that we're seeing with this shift to an online format. So over time, we could see that playing out in a number of ways. So the first is that it might, sorry, I'm just waiting for my clicks to work. Here we go. So this loss of direct access, we're not having these corridor conversations. We're not able to have face-to-face interaction with government officials in New York. Could lead to a lowered accountability of those governments to women's rights. It could also mean that it's harder to get progressive language into the agreed conclusions because we're not able to do that advocacy as effectively. And together those things could lead to worse outcomes for women's rights. You can also see though, we have this other possible impact of this trend, which is that our engagement ends up being channeled through capitals rather than through UN missions. And those are actually the people who are responsible for implementing policies that align to the agreed conclusions. And so if they have better understanding and better accountability to those international agreements, what we might actually see is more accountability. So you can see that it kind of goes off in both directions. On the other top corner over here, we can see this trend of many, many more people participating in CSW in this online format. So we could have a situation where there are millions of feminists every year participating in a vibrant online CSW where the technology never goes wrong, and you never end up in a webinar when you think it's a meeting, and you never break up, you never lose sound. The internet's perfect in this future scenario. But what we could see there is CSW really becoming the preeminent forum that Joanne talked about for women's rights. We could see it using that power of access and convening to really mobilize global action on critical issues. We could also see stronger connections with other social movements. So you might, when it's more easy to access, you might see climate activists coming to CSW to strengthen those connections across movements and leading to more dynamic feminist movements. Of course, we're also seeing in this experience of going online, this reinforcing of the inequalities of access. So that Nalini mentioned earlier, the differences in access to technology, the differences in time available to participate, time zones. It's very early here in Australia, it's very late in Africa. So, it's time zones are tricky, and those inequalities do get or can potentially be amplified through these kinds of forums. So we could see that leading to a real loss of legitimacy of the UN system. That could lead to complete collapse or maybe reform, which I've circled in red as a bad thing, but plenty of people might want to challenge and say, actually, that could be a good outcome, particularly if we see alternative bodies emerge that are led by the global south, that don't replicate these old power structures and that really have that sort of source of legitimacy. So really quickly, I'll just talk through this last set, which is about CSW losing touch with feminist priorities in this online format. And again, we could see that leading to a loss of legitimacy, but potentially we can also see it opening up other spaces, new alliances, new strategic visions of economic well-being, peace and security, and new transnational sites for organising and resistance around the world. So this is the impact wheel that we've put together as the panelists, as the steering group for this project. And what we're really interested in is your reactions to this, to what we've presented. So it's obviously a simplification. We know that trends aren't always linear. It's quite hard to fit them on the screen like this, but we're really interested in your responses about, what's missing, what would you disagree with or challenge, and really critically, what do you think this tells us about what we should be doing now in order to get to a more feminist future? I can already see some of the reflections that were shared before really resonating there in terms of what we should be doing differently. So Aruna, I'll throw it back over to you to moderate people's comments.
Okay, good. So we have Annapurna who would like to comment. So Annapurna, you have the floor. You have to unmute. Annapurna? Okay, Annapurna, you're unmuted. You have the floor. Would you like to comment?
No, not yet. I'm
Not
just
yet?
following it.
Oh,
I'm
you're
following.
following. Okay, all right. I thought you had your hand up. Okay. Yeah. So any comments? Do you like this? Do you like this? Okay, we've got Steph. Steph, is it Steph or Shell? Okay, it's Steph. Steph, there you go.
Thank you. A strength, I think, of this approach is that it allows all of these different trends to coexist. It's kind of that both and approach that all of these trends could be happening at once, which I think is a strength. A question I have is, at the beginning you mentioned, earlier in the presentation you mentioned there we go. Sorry. My question was just, what are the, you mentioned futurist principles and working with futurists in developing some of these tools. Could you tell us a little bit more about what those principles are? Just a quick overview, if possible.
Yeah, sure. So this is one of the futures thinking tools that the futurists that we work with sort of gave us. So yeah, the concept of impact wheels is one of those tools, and the way that it sort of works in the broader methodology is that there's an activity to sort of look at a set of trends, contextualize them, sort of pull them apart, think about how they apply in your experience. You know, the idea is that these trends play out in specific ways in different contexts, but they're trends that are seen all around the world. And then the impact wheel is a way to sort of play out into the future. I'm using hand gestures because that's kind of how I think about it. So you sort of playing it out in the future, and then work your way back down to say, well, if we want to get to this feminist future out here, how do we work backwards? And it's a futures thinking tool called backcasting, which is about essentially reverse engineering. How do we reverse engineer that future, and what does that tell us about what we need to do now? So yeah, that's sort of the tools from futures thinking that the workshop draws from.
Yeah. Maybe Alice, you want to say a little bit about the different kinds of idea or trends, you know, that we brainstormed, because those are really important as a beginning foundation for the toolkit, and then how those we can add to, anybody using this can add to those trends.
Yeah, so the trends that I guess are sort of provided as prompts in the workshop, there's about 20 different trends that were identified by the futurists who we worked with through a technique called horizon scanning, which I don't pretend to be an expert in, but essentially it's my summary, which probably does a great disservice to the expertise and work that goes into it, is that it's about reading the news and reading articles and seeing what people are saying on Twitter, and just looking around at the world and saying, well, what are people talking about? What are the issues? And really distilling that down into sort of into concrete trends. So I'm sure it's much more complex than that, but that's kind of my lay person's explanation. And these trends that were identified by the futurists, and then we sort of worked together, I guess, to narrow down the list to things that we thought were really relevant to feminist movements in particular. So it's a huge range of different things. There's trends sort of around climate change and the disruption that is going to continue to cause into the future. There's trends around who is leading our movements, you know, the increase in women's leadership in different sectors, and what that may or may not enable in terms of feminist social change, or the Black Lives Matter movement and the push for racial equality and racial justice within feminist movements and within the world more broadly, and how that trend might play out over the future. There's things like COVID being used as a cover for human rights violations. So really, you know, looking at the ways in which people are taking advantage of the pandemic to reinforce structures of inequality and marginalization. There's a few around technology and data access. So it sort of provides, I guess, a really broad set of prompts that people then work, you know, collaboratively in a group to figure out, well, what's most relevant to us and the work we're doing together? What do we really want to explore in more detail, and then take that trend through the rest of the exercises.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alice. Any other questions around the tool itself, the methodology, how you can get access to it, how you can get trained in using it?
Aruna, Nasreen asked a really good question.
Nasreen asked a question? Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. So Nasreen says, are those trends observations or dreams? What's the basis for including them in the map? And two, is this a tool for nuanced analysis of multi-layered problems?
Great question. The trends are observations, but the way that they might play out over the future, it could be a dream or a nightmare, I guess. So it's starting with something concrete that we observe in the world and then thinking about how it might play out. So that's sort of our speculation, I guess, about the future. And the idea about, is it a tool for nuanced analysis of multi-layered problems? It's a good question. I think it's one tool. It's not the only tool that you could use. I think, you know, we've seen a lot of interest in people using this methodology to sort of help with strategic planning or, you know, for different kinds of purposes. I think it's one tool that you want to combine with other tools to really, I guess, have like a really, nuanced and well-rounded picture. But I think what it does is it allows you to think really differently and creatively about a problem in a way that you might not usually think about it. Aruna, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I had a question for Maria Jose. When we were putting this impact wheel together, you made a few comments about the way that different trends like unpaid care and the way we structure economies and how those things might interact with this trend of CSW going online. Did you want to talk a little bit about that and sort of how it connects to the stuff in the Oxfam paper?
Yes, thank you, Alice. Yes, I really in the question as well that the colleague wrote about, can it work with multi-layered questions? Of course, thinking about the future is always challenging because there are a lot of things happening at the same time, no? And we have written there, well, CSW goes virtual. But in addition, we can have the issue of virtuality, but we can have different, for example, or when we were speaking about the UN, different possible futures as well about civil society organizations, about communication, about the issue that, for example, it is virtual, it can go in the direction that identity group look for each other, and people sharing the same identity talk to each other only, or what we were saying before about building bridges with other movements. And my question when we were discussing about it was that, no, this how of course in this we have simplified the wheel, but it can try to have several centers at the same time, no? Because there are several dynamics that are happening at the same time and that are influencing each other. And for example, if I can give an example, I listening to Joanne about what, well, the ifs for UN, it can be as well ifs for civil society organizations and for women organizations. Do we need internal change? Last year, for example, with the Black Lives Matter, with different, with the Me Too movement innate, we saw that there are things that we have to look at ourselves as well in order to, well, to be more credible as well when proposing our own proposals to change. are our organizations house for people to share ideas, etc.? What do we need as well to change in our organizations? And I meant perhaps I'm going further from the center in that wheel, but that there are a lot of trends that interact with each other, and sometimes as well we need to humbly, but as well with aspiration, look at ourselves and say, how do we go where we want to go in that wheel? No?
Yeah, thank you very much, Maria Jose. I think we had another question actually about can more than one trend outlined here be fostered and adjusted and redirected at the same time? And I think you addressed that in your response just now, as did Alice, and even just this particular wheel has different trends emerging and playing out at the same time. And as you well said, Alice, it is one tool. Nasreen's comment is a really relevant one, because many of the issues we're thinking about have these multiple layers, and they're pulls and tugs in different directions. And it does force us to try to prioritize and try to think about impact, and consequences. And try to build a strategy of change, but always it's really only a tool that can enable conversations which are much more detailed and nuanced. So it looks like, do we have any more questions? Looks like there are no more questions or comments from the audience. Do you see any?
Aruna?
Yep.
I just wanted to jump in because
Yeah,
I think it was
do.
Lillian from Kenya asked this question about,
right,
which Joe answered about feminism, but it made me think, as Maria Jose and Nalini were also talking, and Alice, that I told you this, Aruna, I was on a panel recently with bilateral donors who were all identifying as feminists. And of course, you have a UN Secretary General who identifies as a feminist. And thinking about this tool, I think one of the other values is that it puts you in the mind frame, in the mindset of thinking forward. Because often I think in feminist organizing, we're reacting, we're responding. Nalini started to talk about that. And, if 15 years ago, someone had told me, the UN Secretary General will say he's a feminist and the heads of all the bilateral donor agencies will say they're feminists, I would have laughed my head off, because at that time, Lillian, in answer to your question, if you said feminist in the UN, you were accused of horrible things. Now, so many people are identifying as feminists. Imagine if 15 years ago we had used this tool to imagine a time when powerful people identified as feminists. What might it have prepared us to think about and organize for and be kind of at the forefront of thinking through those things? So I just want to say, I think that the tool itself, but also the intent of thinking futuristically is something that is so important for movement building and also achieving what it is we care about.
Thank you so much, Joanne. I have Shell who would like to comment. So Shell, you have the floor.
Thanks. Thanks. A couple of reflections here. My mind's it's my first time attending a CSW, so the being virtual enabled that. This tool here seems very useful in doing the forward looking and envisioning, and I'm totally on board with senses of finding where you want to go and reverse engineer. At the same time, it seems a very elaborate, fancy pro and con list, and looking at you know, what's over time. And I think there's the danger of getting caught up in the technology of here's a new game and we can spend hours and hours. And yes, maybe certainly some idea you hadn't come across will come out of this, but the gist of where we need to go for a feminist world, I think is fairly clear cut. I'm looking at where you're talking about the hybrid format and that a limited in-person participation, which I think that component, if that is as strong as well as being virtual, and then to delocate it out of New York, have them in different places at different years, and centering more on the global South seems to be a way of dealing with some of the issues that we need to address. In terms of this year, I've been overwhelmed with there's so many things in parallel, and it seems to have just like fragmented into like 40 different little conversations, many of which, when I've popped in on them, seem to be basically saying a lot the same thing, but seems to fragment, and just the overwhelm of trying to look at it all. It's kind of great that it's over 2 weeks, but at the same time, that seems to dilute it. And thank you all for what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shell. We have a really nice question, and I'd like to end with that and have for all the panelists to comment on this. So we have a question from Lisa, and Lisa Williams, and Lisa says, post-COVID, with all its disruption, and with feminism itself being a force for disruption of the status quo, what one thing or one lesson has really resonated for you as a game-changing aspect of your work from this point onwards? One thing, one lesson that's really resonated for you as game-changing. So I'm going to ask the panelists to comment on that, and we're going to wrap up after that. So can we turn to who would like to speak? How about Nalini?
Yes, I go first. Thank you so much, Vinaka, Lisa. Aruna, Lisa is from the Pacific, so I'm so glad that someone's from my region is joining in. A very good question. And I think there's so many things, but if I have to, and just to be a little provocative, I have to say that for me and my organization, one thing that this last year and moving on now has really honed in is that the work that needs to be done, understood, the analysis that needs to happen, the programs that need to be designed, the budgets that need to be developed, both at the government level, our level, developer models with the donor partners, everyone. It needs to reflect our contextual reality. Otherwise, it is just noise and does not make the kind of difference it should make. At the grassroots level, at the community level, at the level where it is meant to make the impact. Because if we are talking, and we have talked about this for such a long time, of that funding for women's rights work is diminishing. This last year has put on different priorities. We are still talking about what's happening to our national budgets, the coffers that are meant to be looking after our needs. We are talking about studies, data, all of that stuff. And for me, if it is not based on contextual realities, if it's not based on what is happening in a particular country, looking at how the emerging and existing issues are intersecting with our lives, then it's pointless. So it is putting a scrutiny as to how the meager resources are being, put to good use. So for an example, the various recognizing local expertise and using that. So Fiji, for one, our government is now recognizing some organizations locally have the expertise. You do not need to get international consultants to do the work. So for me, that has honed that message in, and I'm very passionate about that one. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nalini. Alice.
Yeah, just really briefly, I think the thing that has really stayed with me, which came up in one of the early workshops that we held, is just simply that feminist organizations need to care as much about racial justice as they do about gender justice. And I hope that that's going to be a real turning point going forward.
Thank you so much. Maria Jose, one lesson.
Yes, well, I think that this moment, this crisis, someone was writing in the chat how this has affected women's rights organizations, people's lives, and so on. Unleash to a point the imagination as well. The world started to be a place that was strange, and in our work as well, I think that we started allowing ourselves to think in different ways, in different directions, no? And completely agreeing as well with what Joanne has said before about the importance of imagining in order to start moving or to move in that direction and to move collectively. And I want to bring something that someone put in the chat at the beginning when we asked what a feminist future will be for you, and someone wrote that it will bring as well joy. You know? We have started as well to think about societies that are nicer to people, in which there is less exploitation and less self-exploitation. And it will be great if we move as well in the direction to bring, to change the economic instruments that we have now to measure growth in order to take the temperature of joys in our societies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've got some really, really good comments relevant to women's needs on the in communities, joy, intersectional focus with racism, gender, other issues, care. Joanne, you get to have the last word.
Well, I love what Shell put, compost the patriarchy, because I was gonna say, Aruna, you haven't had a word. What about you?
I agree with all of you.
Because you and I have been part of this process, but one of the things that has come up during the our COVID conversations is it really matters what you call things. And, we talk about gender equality strategies and plans, et cetera, and we've worked in organizations to do that. What if we started with dismantling patriarchal power? What if instead of working on gender equality, we worked on dismantling patriarchal power? How would that reframe what it is we're trying to do and create more space for us to achieve gender equity and gender justice, but through a different way? So that's one of the things that I've taken away from this time, largely, Aruna, because of you and the conversations you started. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think, tempered radicalism is good, and it has its purposes. And Joanne, you raised the issue early on in the conversation. How much have we gained through that? And that is the right question. How much have we gained through that? And we have gained a lot, and we should know what we've gained, but we should also know what we haven't gained, and the imagination of what dismantling patriarchy and dismantling patriarchal institutions and imagining new ways of organizing and new models of organization is really critical. Even if, you know, it's not just a slash and burn strategy, it's we need to open our minds to what might that look like, just like the feminist economists are opening our minds to, you know, it's not about growth, it's about care and well-being. It's a very different paradigm. And so that's a good way to end. Brilliant. Create feminist infrastructures. Thank you. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, IWDA. Thank you, panelists.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, participants, for a fantastic session. Good luck to you all. Down with
Thanks,
patriarchy.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.